2022 changed everything. Russia invaded Ukraine, sparking the biggest war in Europe since 1945 and shaking the global order to its core. But things could have been so much worse. Because while Russia pushed west, another superpower was watching: China. And China wants Taiwan. Back then, as missiles rained down on Kiev, Beijing wondered, should China stay patient or seize the chaos? In our world, they chose patience, to observe how the West reacts to Russia's aggression. But what if they didn't? What if, in 2022, China risked it all and invaded Taiwan? If you enjoy modern day alternate history like this one, consider subscribing. Also, this video is the first one that has been decided through a Patreon poll. If you want to decide which one of the options on screen I should make next month, check out my Patreon. Now, why does China even want Taiwan? Taiwan was part of China until the Chinese Civil War. There, the communists gained the upper hand, forcing the Kuomintang to flee to Taiwan. Ever since then, the island has been a thorn in the CCP's eye, the final piece of their unfinished puzzle. But the real reason they want Taiwan is power. China wants to be an uncontested global superpower, and the island is the key. Taiwan is the leading manufacturer in microchips and could function as a critical launchpad for China to control the South China Sea, the busiest water on Earth. And most crucially, reconquering Taiwan would be a huge propaganda victory. Successfully invading Taiwan would ultimately prove that the US is not the world hegemon any longer. That's all very oversimplified, but I think you get the picture. Before we start with the alternate timeline, there's one more thing we need to answer. Why 2022? Why this exact year? 2022 wasn't just chaotic, it was the perfect storm. The US and Europe were stretched thin, distracted by Ukraine. If China ever had a window to strike, this was it. If China struck in 2022, the US would face a terrifying choice: defend Europe or defend Taiwan. In early 2022, the political world is increasingly focused on Russia's troop buildup along Ukraine. In the West, leaders are told that there is no way Russia will invade Ukraine. That's simply crazy. In China, the CCP Politburo is discussing what to do if China actually invades. They think it's unlikely, but the CCP decides that if Russia does the unthinkable, China needs to seriously consider exploiting the chaos. On February 24, 2022, Russia invades. The West is shocked, but China begins calculating. Xi Jinping is told that this is the narrowest window China will ever get. In the coming days, China's Central Military Commission meets in emergency sessions. They assess NATO's response, the US commitment to Europe and global economic stability, and within a week, China makes a covert decision. They begin full invasion preparation. In Fujian province, massive but disguised military drills begin. Chinese cyber units go active to map Taiwan's infrastructure and prepare to jam comms and blind satellites. Propaganda slowly wraps up. Xi Jinping talks about national destiny and a historic moment on the horizon. He also commits fully to the Russo-Chinese partnership, and the two nations begin intelligence sharing. The West, of course, notices China mobilizing. Joe Biden is briefed and the US begins background preparations. American troops get moved to military bases in Japan, South Korea and the Philippines. Taiwan's premier desperately tries to get Joe Biden to openly state that the US will defend Taiwan, and Joe Biden follows suit. He announces US commitment to defend Taiwan, and the US military increases readiness in the Pacific.
One China policy, we report all that we've done in the past, but that does not mean that China has the ability, the jurisdiction to go in and use force to take over Taiwan. So we stand firmly with Japan and with other nations not to let that happen.
But deterrence is too late now. China has made its choice. On May 20, Chinese warships and fighter jets cross the Taiwan Strait. It's a blitz aimed to force Taiwan to surrender before the US can react. Chinese warships quickly establish a full naval blockade. The Chinese Air Force gains total air control over the island before the US can even respond. Missiles rain down on Taiwanese military bases. Cyber attacks cripple Taiwan's power grid, infrastructure and communications. And amphibious assaults, supported by airdrops, land on northern and southern beaches. The biggest amphibious invasion in history just started. And China didn't just strike Taiwan. They also launched missile attacks against close-by US military bases like Guam to cripple their response. The US just suffered a modern-day Pearl Harbor. By the beginning of the year, nobody thought Russia would dare to invade Ukraine. Now Chinese missiles rained down on US military bases. And America now has to make perhaps the most important decision of the 21st century. Commit to Europe or commit to Taiwan. Funnily enough, roughly 80 years ago, the US had to make a very similar decision. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and Germany declared war. The US back then assessed that the European theater takes priority. Now America makes the opposite choice. China is the bigger threat than Russia. Taiwan is strategically more important than Ukraine. And unlike Taiwan, Ukraine still has Europe behind their back. The US commits to a Pacific first, Europe second policy. On May 21, Joe Biden holds an emergency speech and formally declares war against China. Joe Biden's speech declaring war on China immediately goes viral.
We never bow, we never bend, we never break when confronted with crisis.
Edits from the speech spread like wildfire. Tweets like, "We got World War III before GTA 6 go viral. Imagine the feeling of someone in this alternate world. They witnessed Russia's insane invasion of Ukraine, just like we did. Then they heard news that China might invade Taiwan, and suddenly, on a normal day, by late May, they find out that China struck US bases and landed in Taiwan. Hours later, they see edits of Joe Biden declaring war against China.
We are America, second to none, and we own the finish line.
On Fox News and CNN, experts are debating if this could already be classified as World War III. They're split on the issue, but the internet is in consensus. The third part of the trilogy has begun. And it's not like a dystopian horror movie or apocalyptic nightmare. Instead, the beginning of World War III feels deeply absurd. Far-right Republicans like Laura Loomer immediately start accusing Biden of starting the war. But the one thing that can defeat America's division is extreme patriotism. And thanks to Biden's speech being actually eligible and very patriotic, most of the population rallies behind him. By May 23, the US Navy manages to break through the Chinese blockade after a heavy naval battle south of Taiwan. And while Taiwan is facing heavy bombing campaigns, they are prepared. They knew this war could happen for years, and crucially, they've seen in Ukraine that resistance against a superior opponent still works, and Taiwan has easily defendable territory. Neither the Soviet Union nor the US could defeat Afghanistan's mountains, and I don't even want to start with Vietnam's jungles. Taiwan has both mountains and jungles. And they have the US as their ally. After the initial shock of the invasion, the Taiwanese population gains a huge fighting spirit, comparable to the indomitable spirit of the Ukrainian people. The US tries to rally their allies in the Pacific, but Japan, South Korea and Australia remain hesitant, only sending lethal aid. Europe is in a tough spot. They are now forced to support Ukraine all on their own, and the continent is now convinced that this isn't just a war for Ukraine. NATO military analysts all argue that Russia and China are devoted to bring down the Western world order. They warn that it's just a matter of time before Chinese troops will fight alongside Russia to attack the Suwalki Gap in the Baltic states. European nations now fully commit to jumpstart their defense capabilities overnight. Europe has the industry and manpower to defeat Russia, even if China were to help them. What they don't have is time. This is like the build-up to World War II all over again. The Allies have to stall to build up their military. The moment the US committed to Taiwan, they dropped the majority of their military aid to Ukraine. But that doesn't mean Ukraine will fall. Russia isn't World War II Germany. Their military is not as strong as the world believed, and unlike with Poland in 1939, Europe is determined to keep Ukraine alive. Just 2 days after China landed in Taiwan, Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, approves to send over 50 Leopard tanks to Ukraine. He was a chicken in our time, but the seriousness of the situation would force even him out of the henhouse.
Also deliver battle tanks to Ukraine Leopard 2 tanks. That is the result of a very close and intense discussions with our partners, with our allies.
Other European nations react similarly. Macron seriously suggests that France could send troops to Ukraine, not to fight directly, but to help with border patrol and air defense. On May 24, the EU holds emergency meetings where all major nations agree Europe must rearm to fill the void left by the US. The same day as the meeting started, leaks reached the press that the EU is negotiating to build a European army. By that point, propaganda around the world is going crazy. All you see on the internet are military analytics, news reports, edits of Joe Biden declaring war on China, and memes about Germany rearming to finally win a global war. On May 25, Japan declares limited war support and allows the US full use of Okinawa and begins intercepting Chinese missiles. On the same day, China and Russia formalize their alliance and frame it as a joint anti-imperialistic war. China covertly sends a unit of 10,000 soldiers to assist Russia in Ukraine. As a reaction, Macron announces that France will send several hundred elite soldiers to Kiev. They won't engage in combat directly, but will help with personal security for Zelensky and air defense. This move is incredibly controversial. Many celebrate Macron for standing so strongly against Russian aggression. Others argue he is needlessly escalating. Boris Johnson, still the Prime Minister of the UK, but faced with heavy scandals, follows Macron's lead and also announces to send soldiers to the Ukrainian-Belarusian border to free troops and deter Belarus from joining the war. It's obvious that he wants to escalate to stay in power and save his very tainted image. Memes compare strongman images of Winston Churchill with goofy pictures of Boris Johnson. On May 27, large-scale cyber attacks hit the US mainland, leaving several major cities without power for hours. This sparks a large panic inside America and people begin hamster buying. The US government urges people not to panic and that everything is under control. But by that point, people are already on their way to the nearest grocery store. And just like 2 years ago when COVID hit, their priority isn't food or water, but toilet paper. Wall Street fully crashes and the world enters a global recession. To boost the economy, Joe Biden orders that all frozen Chinese assets be liquefied. On May 28, North Korea starts large-scale missile tests and also sends 6,000 soldiers to support Russia in Ukraine. Speaking of Ukraine, Russia in this timeline is advancing noticeably faster than in ours. While Ukraine's stocks aren't depleted yet, US intelligence is stretched thin, a gap Europe can't fill. On the same day, satellite images show signs of Russia mobilizing along the Belarus-Ukraine border. On May 29, on British television, Boris Johnson tells Brits to prepare for war. The sides of World War III are by now very clear. NATO and Allies versus the Russo-Chinese alliance backed by North Korea and Iran. The rest of the world remains mostly neutral, but many covertly support the West. India, the most crucial neutral state, mobilizes troops and reinforces its borders. Behind the scenes, they covertly send artillery ammunition and mobile air defenses to Ukraine through the Czech Republic. On May 30, just while everyone is distracted and people thought things couldn't escalate further, hundreds of pages belonging to Hezbollah's leadership explode. Immediately after, Israeli missiles and fighter jets take off and begin hitting Iranian and Syrian targets. In Syria, rebels begin moving against the Assad regime, weakened by the lack of Russian support and Israeli airstrikes. The Middle East is now at war too. Within 2 weeks of Israel's surprise attack, Syrian rebels manage to reach Damascus. Bashar al-Assad jumps in his airplane to flee to Russia, but Israeli fighter jets engage and shoot him down. The Prince of Syria has fallen. Iran has now lost 2 of their biggest weapons against Israel, and the US is moving into position to strike Iranian nuclear facilities. Their resources are stretched thin, but they have no other choice. Iran is now attempting to dash for a nuclear weapon. They have managed to overwhelm the Iron Dome, and hundreds of Iranian missiles have devastated Israeli cities, but they can't win the air war in the long run. Netanyahu is contemplating to use a nuke against Iran, but the Americans pressure him out of the idea. Instead, on May 31, American B-2 bombers destroy Iranian underground uranium enrichment facilities with bunker buster bombs. The US is now at war with Iran too, and Iran, forced into a corner, launches their strongest missiles against US bases around the Middle East. As a response, Turkey and the UK also declare war against Iran, citing NATO's Article 5. Within 2 weeks, the combined efforts of the US, Israel, Turkey and the UK managed to take out all senior Iranian leaders. By June 16, Iran is facing a full-scale rebellion from within that quickly turns into a civil war. The first enemy of the Allies has fallen, but Iran isn't the only country in the axis of evil bleeding heavily. China's invasion of Taiwan is turning into a total slaughter. I mentioned before that Taiwan has mountains and jungles, terrains that are very advantageous for defensive guerrilla warfare. Taiwan leverages that and inflicts heavy casualties on the People's Liberation Army. And China isn't even making huge advancements. They have gained some territory in the north, but in the south they are stuck hard. But not all fronts are looking bad for the axis of evil. In the east, Ukraine is pushed behind the Dnieper River to the outskirts of Odessa. Russia managed these advancements thanks to the lack of US support to Ukraine and direct Chinese and North Korean support. By June 28, China prepares to send another 30,000 soldiers to Ukraine, while North Korea is also mobilizing to send more. North Korea also constantly threatens South Korea and conducts missile tests on a daily basis. And the intimidation is working. South Korea has not yet officially joined the war against China, fearing North Korea will attack once they do. South Korea is more like the Allied arms supplier, being paranoid about their crazy neighbor up north. In Europe, the wartime industry is slowly but steadily picking up steam. Germany is now spending 6% of their GDP on defense. In early July, both Finland and Sweden officially become NATO members, and shortly after, on July 10, the situation further escalates. In Belarus, there has been a steady troop buildup, 20,000 Russian units mobilized shortly after World War III started, and newly arrived 30,000 Chinese troops, and now they attack. But they're not just attacking Ukrainian soldiers. Over 10,000 British troops are stationed along the Ukrainian-Belarusian border. The United Kingdom, under the leadership of none other than Boris Johnson himself, is now officially at war with Belarus, Russia and China. And NATO follows suit. All NATO members formally declare war against Belarus and Russia. Their joint goal is to establish a no-fly zone over Belarus and Ukraine as quickly as possible. British, Polish, French and German fighter jets take off to shoot down anything Russian flying over Belarus or Ukraine. Allied warships meanwhile turn the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake, completely cutting Russia off from Kaliningrad. But Russia still made advances elsewhere. They managed to push into Odessa with the help of their Wagner mercenary force, leaving behind a trail of blood. On July 30, the full-scale Wagner assault on Odessa begins. By that point, drone warfare is becoming increasingly more important in combat. Europe, the US, China and Russia are all making rapid advances to their drone warfare capabilities. In Seattle, Los Angeles, Chicago and co., hundreds of drone factories open up, building thousands of cheap drones being shipped off to Taiwan and Ukraine. But China is producing even more drones. The US strategy until this point has been not to send troops to Taiwan, but rather help the island defend itself as much as possible, while fighting China on the water and in the air. That strategy is very smart for the US long term, but the Taiwanese population is suffering, especially with China's brutal drone warfare. But all that suffering is only strengthening Taiwan's morale. They are determined, they are on the right side, and there is no way in hell they will surrender. The same can't be said for everyone. By early 2023, the front lines largely stall thanks to drone warfare. Russia is barely able to make advances in Ukraine and their stocks are suffering. Prigozhin is increasingly complaining about ammunition shortages.
У нас нехватка боеприпасов 70%! Шойгу! Герасимов! Где боеприпасы?
His Wagner mercenaries die like flies in Odessa, while Moscow can't even give them enough bullets. Odessa is slowly turning into a modern-day Stalingrad. Only this time, the Russians are the aggressors. Thanks to British and French troops in northern Ukraine and NATO air support, Russia is held at bay for now. And week by week, new videos of Prigozhin becoming increasingly frustrated with Shoigu and Gerasimov emerge. Putin meanwhile is forced to also draft people from Moscow and St. Petersburg to keep the war effort going. This enrages several elites and the citizens of Moscow and St. Petersburg. The CIA senses that this could be a crucial Russian weakness, and they were right. In another complete twist of events, on April 10, 2023, almost a year after the start of World War III, Wagner soldiers suddenly make their way towards Russia. They quickly capture the strategic city of Rostov-on-Don and declare a patriotic uprising against military incompetence and corruption. The people of Rostov cheer. After the capture of Rostov, protests break out in Moscow, St. Petersburg and other major Russian cities. The Russian police manages to suppress them in most cities, but by that point the Kremlin is slowly losing their narrative. And Wagner, instead of marching towards Moscow, stays in Rostov. Much of the military personnel present in the city joins them in fortifying the city. While Putin contemplates what to do, NATO begins covert negotiations with Prigozhin. They grant him full immunity and even promise to diplomatically back him to take over Russia if he speaks out against the war in Ukraine and vows to end it. And the ever power-hungry Prigozhin does just that. He urges Russian soldiers to return back to Russia and join him in the rebellion. And the message kinda works. Several Russian battalions turn their back on Ukraine and move towards Rostov. Putin is now becoming very paranoid. He begins purging generals at random in an attempt to assert control. But his move backfires. On April 22, Putin falls out of a Kremlin window. The most notorious dictator of the 21st century didn't go out with a bang. He went down quietly, just like all the people before that opposed him. Shortly after, Shoigu, Gerasimov and a few other top Russian generals also go missing. The next day, on April 23, General Alexei Dyumin, who once was Putin's bodyguard, announces on Russian television that Putin is dead. He also announces that he is his legitimate successor and he will now lead Russia into the future. The remaining military high command is behind him. Without public announcement, Boris Johnson, Macron, Zelensky, Dyumin and Prigozhin meet in Qatar to begin round-table negotiations. Dyumin wants an end to the Wagner uprising so he can gain legitimacy and popularity. He opens the negotiations by offering a ceasefire in Ukraine in exchange for international recognition. NATO is willing, but only if Wagner lays down its arms. Ukraine is skeptical. They neither trust Wagner nor Dyumin. Prigozhin refuses to disband the rebellion unless Wagner is given full amnesty. After 4 days of more back and forth, Dyumin commits to a strategic pivot. He secretly agrees with NATO to total peace in Ukraine with the pre-war 2022 borders. In return, he gets full diplomatic recognition and the lifting of some sanctions placed on Russia, but he needs Wagner neutralized. So Dyumin and NATO cut a secret deal. They agree to Wagner's demands. Prigozhin returns to Rostov only to be poisoned a day later. Dyumin announces the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine and issues an ultimatum to the remaining forces in Rostov: be integrated into the Russian army with full amnesty or face war. NATO backs him. Wagner's soldiers complying with Dyumin will not face international persecution for their actions in World War III. I think you can guess what Wagner mercenaries would do here. NATO has come out on top. Ukraine is not happy with the West, allowing Dyumin to keep Crimea and for giving Wagner amnesty, but at least there's peace. By April 29, the European front of World War III is officially over, but World War III itself isn't over. China still stands. Xi Jinping has just witnessed the quick and chaotic fall of Putin, a dictator thought to be untouchable. In his newfound paranoia, Xi Jinping commits to a final victory doctrine. The US still hasn't sent troops to Taiwan. Instead, they are just pumping the island full with weapons while breaking China's naval blockades and air support. Xi is hoping that with total psychological dominance over Taiwan, he can force the island to capitulate before the US commits troops. Missiles now deliberately target population centers, not military targets. PLA death squads sweep captured towns, hunting local officials and Western collaborators. Civilian deaths skyrocket, and within 2 weeks they reach over 50,000. The Chinese Air Force bombs cultural landmarks, power plants and hospitals. Geneva Convention violations turn into a daily thing. On June 10, international media leaks footage of chemical weapons being used in Kaohsiung. China denies this, but the evidence is obvious. Taiwan frames China's aggression as a new Nanjing, which solidifies total national unity. Joe Biden, under diplomatic pressure, is now forced to commit troops to Taiwan. 10,000 Marines are mobilized and sent to southern Taiwan. The US Air Force and carrier strike groups shift their focus from the South China Sea to Taiwan itself. Japan and Australia now begin full mobilizations, preparing to fully join the war if necessary. Xi heavily condemns US escalation and threatens with all-out nuclear war. Large-scale cyber attacks and drone strikes hit Guam, stretching US logistics thin. Inside the US, fiery debates are going on how to deal with China's increasing desperation. To American media, it's obvious that China is losing. A nation backed into a corner is extremely dangerous, and by June 2023, Taiwan is completely backed into a corner. Their population is suffering massively, and the US, even with the 10,000 Marines deployed to the island, can't protect Taiwanese civilians. Covertly, behind the scenes, and without notifying the US or any other ally, Taiwan smuggles drone operators and very effective suicide drones into China. By late July, the task force is ready to hit the target. Taiwan's military leadership gives the order: execute Operation Broken Dragon. In the night of July 25, 7 freight trucks, all conveniently parked just miles away from each other, open their doors. Swarms of drones fly out. They all have the same target: the Three Gorges Dam, the biggest dam in the world. China's energy crown jewel. The drones rupture key pressure points, cracking internal floodgates and secondary walls. The dam breaks. Floods rush down the Yangtze River to cities like Jiachang, Jiangsu and parts of Wuhan. The CCP scrambles to black out the event. Chinese internet and state media don't mention it, but an event like this can't be hidden. Taiwan broke China's back. US intelligence estimates that the attack will cost over 100,000 civilian casualties, and over 1 million people are already evacuating just hours after the dam broke. All of central China is paralyzed. Taiwan says it had nothing to do with the attack, claiming it was conducted by internal Chinese saboteurs. The US also quickly issues a statement that they had no knowledge of the attack and heavily condone it. Nobody is taking responsibility. Xi Jinping tries to blame it on Taiwan and frames the nation as a rogue terror state that needs to be put to justice. But the Chinese elite already views the event as a complete strategic failure by his leadership. Chinese generals are furious at Xi for leaving key infrastructure vulnerable. But in truth, nobody could have seen an attack like that coming. In top secret meetings, the Chinese Standing Committee fractures. Hardliners push for full nuclear retaliation, while others pressure for negotiation. It is clear to them China lost the war. Not only did they fail to conquer Taiwan, they couldn't even keep their own population safe. The only remaining question is, should they drag Taiwan down with them or face defeat? Food and energy shortages quickly sweep across China. Central provinces hit hardest by the disaster begin ignoring Beijing. Local leaders are focused on survival now, not war. On July 29, 4 days after the dam was struck, Xi Jinping disappears from public eye, apparently due to health reasons. A day later, the bombings of Taiwanese cities suddenly stop. High-ranking Chinese generals begin negotiating with the US for a ceasefire. Internally, they frame it as a strategic repositioning, not as a surrender. By the start of August, Beijing withdraws most of its forces from Taiwan, leaving behind some scattered and demoralized troops, which shortly after surrender to the Taiwanese military. By August 28, Taiwan declares the war to be over. They have survived their worst existential crisis in history. Technically, the US and China still are at war, and their navies engage in some skirmishes over remote islands, but everyone knows it's just a question of time now. By November 2nd, a historic peace summit is held in Jakarta, hosted by Indonesia and backed by the UN, ASEAN and neutral powers like Brazil and India. China signs an armistice, not a formal peace, to save face and avoid full admission of defeat. Taiwan is not recognized as independent, but its de facto sovereignty is globally accepted, even by some in the Chinese sphere. The new Chinese leadership is now focused on internal stability. Hong Kong, Xinjiang and central provinces hit by the Great Flood are exploding in dissent. The CCP also purges Xi loyalists to fully move away from his influence. World War III is over. The Allies have won. Ukraine still stands. Putin is dead. Xi Jinping has disappeared. China has backed out of Taiwan, and the US gained several new military bases in the Pacific. The image of American hegemony still stands. But now that the world has seen global war yet again, nations quickly begin arming themselves as much as possible. The US commits further troops to the Pacific, now permanently stationing soldiers in Taiwan. The European Union is on track to build its own army on par with other global powers. The new Chinese leadership is crushing dissent even more brutally than under Xi Jinping. And with Wagner fully integrated and the lessons learned from the Ukraine war, Duman's Russia is arguably more powerful than under Putin. Experts warn that this closely resembles the conditions after World War I. Russia and China are embarrassed and angry, and the world just touched the surface of what new technologies like drones and AI could bring to warfare. But how this scenario continues is a topic for discussion in the comments now. Do you think Joe Biden could win re-election thanks to winning World War III? Or would Trump's now ironic talking point of no new wars hit even harder in this timeline? If you enjoyed this crazy and admittedly a bit over the top scenario, please consider subscribing. If you want early access to my future videos and vote in polls what future videos will be about, check out my Patreon. A special thanks to Owlhouse and Sulfur Crested Kakadu fan, whose vote decided the topic of this video. Now, if you want a video about a timeline that is way better than this one, check out my video about one judge voting differently in 2000, making the entire 21st century almost unrecognizable.